Kraai, and today I'd like to talk about knight endgames. Knight endgames are some of the most difficult endgames around, maybe the most difficult, primarily because the knight is a very wily, tricky piece. The next reason they're really complicated is that it's actually very difficult to find a way to draw if you are the side with less material. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this endgame was that it's very hard to understand this endgame if you're coming to this endgame from a perspective of not having actually listened or studied with a high-level player. And what I mean by that is that if you look at knight endgames in a book, they'll usually give you a lot of variations. But what we can do on chess lectures, we can talk about things and try to give a more general overview of the picture. And a lot of kinds of chess positions, I think talking about a position is much more helpful than a bunch of variations. So, the first rule that I'm going to drill into this lecture again and again is what we can call Botvinnik's rule. And that is, you just take away the knights, like say in this position, we just take away the knight on e4 and the knight on c6. If you take those away and the endgame is a one king and pawn endgame, then the endgame will also be one with knights on the board. Okay? Now, this is actually a very deep statement, a very hard statement to understand. So I'm going to be talking about this example plus two other ones, and we'll try to understand how that is, why that is. Now, this first position, I'm not actually going to analyze too much at all. But what I would suggest is you take a position like this and use it as a training example with a partner. Now, if you apply Botvinnik's rule to this position, what I think you'll find is you can put the knights just about anywhere in the vicinity of the pawns, and the kings just about anywhere in the vicinity of the pawns, and it will always be one for white. Okay. This is kind of a hard thing to understand because I think a lot of players would have the intuition that, well, shouldn't it be a draw? Because if black exchanges some pawns, he can always sacrifice his knight for some or one of white's pawns and achieve a drawing position. But in fact, that's not the case. And in the next two examples, I'll try to make clear why that is so. Okay? Okay, so the following position is taken from the game Yusupov against Voigt, 1993 in Altensteig. And it's black to move. And if you want to, you could hit the pause button and try to see what black should do and what the result should be. Okay, this position I find very instructive. If we look at what's going on, the knight on g5 looks like it has the f6 pawn very strongly blockaded. And even though the black king is out of it, the knight on c3 really hasn't yet to make himself felt in any kind of significant way. So it turns out in this position, black can find kind of a miracle draw, but that's usually not what happens in a practical game. And let's look at what happened in the game. Black made a very sensible maneuver here, very intuitively logical, but it's going to lose. And the point is going to be really that even with one pawn left, where you would think that black should always be able to draw comfortably, because it would seem he could always sacrifice his knight for the pawn, that in fact, even in that kind of position, it's going to turn out that it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for black to draw most of these positions. And that should make Botvinnik's rule very clear, that, again, if it's one as a king and pawn endgame, it's going to be one as a knight endgame. So let's take a look at what black did. Black, I thought, played very sensibly. He tried to get his knight into a more active location on e5. And here Yusupov did something very interesting. You just push the knight away, and then king d6, very nice move, shouldering the black king. And so what this demonstrates really is that Yusupov is not in a hurry to push this pawn on f6. He's realizing that this is a technically won endgame as it is, and all we have to do is deny black counterplay. So the game continued, knight d8, knight d5 check, king d7, king d7. We get this little dance again. Knight f4, and we'll see why that's important in a moment. So the point is that now, after a move like knight g5, we have knight e6, and black is in real trouble. Notice that coming back to defend the f8 square isn't going to help either. For example, f7, and now next we can play either knight g5 or knight f4, h5, f6, driving the knight on h7 out of there. So let's step back. So in this position, really what black had to realize is that the only way he's going to make a draw is to activate his king before white's knight on c3 can become a potent piece. So, for example, he should play king b7, trying to get in to the white position. And now, if white responds king d7, black can just go back, king b6, and again he's threatening to come in via king c5. So the only real chance would be to play something like king e7. And the point is now black can play king c6, and after knight e4, black can get kind of a miracle draw here with knight f3. The point is, if f7, then knight e5, f8, knight g6, drawing. And that really can't be stopped, because if king e6, then again black can play knight d4, and there's going to be no way to really stop the knight from being a potent force. For example, something like this, knight d4, f7, and we can just play king d7, because again, if f8 queen, then knight e6, winning the queen back. So what I think we see in this position is it's a very practical position. The white king is better than the black king, and this we would consider a winning king and pawn endgame. It would be obvious, right, if we just took the knights away. But the point is that it's also winning king and knight endgame, and that the knight is very clumsy in stopping the passed pawn. And you can imagine a whole number of positions like this where white has an extra pawn, and if we just took away the knights, it would be a winning king and pawn endgame. Now, the reason why this rule is so important is that in practical play, it's going to be impossible for anybody to calculate this kind of position. Okay? You have to basically have a large overview, which the Botvinnik rule gives you. So, for example, I have a feeling that Vogts in this position probably thought he was drawing after knight f7. That's the whole problem with with the knight endgames, is they look like they're drawn. Like this looks like they're drawn, but we saw with Yusupov's technique that in fact was winning for white. Okay. Black, however, probably thought it was drawn if he just put his knight into a more active location on e5, when in fact he had to activate his own king as quickly as possible before white's knight on c3 became active. So you can imagine all these series of positions, just where that knight on c3 would be a little bit more active, are going to be lost for the black pieces. So that's my first example of knight ending with just an extra pawn more being won. So let's take a look at one more position. Okay, so this is the final example concerning the knight endgames. Now, it really presents a corollary of what we were talking about before, that any knight endgame that would be won with the knights off, i.e. in the king endgame, will be also won as a knight endgame. And the point about this position is the corollary it presents is that it demonstrates how difficult it is for the defending knight to stop a passed A pawn. And this is in contrast to, say, rook endgames, where the rook pawn is the most easy to stop. And the main problem really is kind of obvious, is that it's harder for black to touch the sides of the board. For example, on the square, to touch the square A8, the knight would have to be on either C7 or B6. To touch the square A7, the knight would have to be on either B5, C6, or C8. So, not surprisingly, we're going to have to try to dominate the knight from touching those squares. So this is a study by Richard Reddy from 1929, and if you'd like to try to solve it, I encourage you to hit the pause button on the VCR control. Okay, the first move shouldn't come as too big of a surprise given what we learned in the last endgame, that the main purpose is going to be to try to control the enemy knight. So white's first move is king A7, and his major threat is to go to B6. If he gets to B6, he'll be in a state of domination over the knight, who won't be able to come to C6. In my prior lecture on knight endgames, I called this the tsuji of the knight. So black has to stop that. He must play king B5. After king B5, however, we see something very instructive by white. White can now play knight B4. The point is that this initiates what's called a deflective knight sacrifice, which is very critical in these kinds of positions. For example, if the king now takes the knight, now king B6, and we don't really need the knight. What this demonstrates is that this pawn on A6 is so strong against a knight. He can't stop the pawn from coming to A8. B6 versus the knight, king on B6 versus the knight on D8 is the tsuji we're looking for. So king A5, now king B8. Knight C6. It looks like we've blown it, but now just simply king B7. What can he do? He can't take our knight on B4 with either the king or the knight. Our pawn will advance. So he has to come back and check us again. Knight D8, king C7, knight E6, king B8. Notice this knight on B4 is a very tricky piece. He's preventing the king from taking the pawn, and this is a strategy you'll see in many knight endgames. Okay, so knight king D8, knight C5, A7, knight D7, king C7, knight B6. And so it looks maybe as if black has suddenly saved himself, but the problem is really that this knight on B6 will always be able to be deflected from that A8 square. So now, for example, all white has to do is play king B7, king D5 is forced, and now just knight D5, and there's no way for the black knight to touch A8 anymore. So, what I hope I've shown today is something that I didn't understand when I was growing up reading books with knight endgames with very long variations. The point is that knight endgames will always require many long variations, but you have to be able to evaluate the position at a glance. Otherwise, you won't know what you're really looking for. And the two rules I presented today hopefully will help you do that. Namely, that just about any position that would be won as a king and pawn endgame is going to be won as a knight endgame. And then as a corollary, that the defending knight will have particular trouble when it comes to stopping a rook pawn. This is International Master Jesse Kraai, hoping you found this knight endgame tutorial instructive.